Hey everybody. I've got an update on the Fireboss that went down off the coast of St. John's in the North Atlantic last week, and it's a possible cause of the crash. My name's Kerry McCauley, and welcome to my channel. Now, as you might remember, last week a Fireboss air tractor converted to a firebomber went down on a ferry flight from St. John's, Newfoundland to Santa Maria in the Azores. It went down about 120 miles into the flight. And originally, I'd suspected icing as a problem. He was flying into an area of moisture in freezing conditions, and the Fireboss is not certified for flight in known ice, doesn't really have any de-ice capability, and so icing was, in my mind, the number one suspect, but some new information has come to light that might be changing that. So as soon as I posted the video last week, got a lot of comments and a few emails about the incident. And one of them was from a ferry pilot who had delivered hundreds of these air tractors and a few of the Firebosses. And he said that there's something unique about the Fireboss in that the 820-gallon hopper that the water gets stored in after it's scooped, from the floats up into the hopper, and that's what they use to put out fires. The top of the hopper has a big opening, an air opening that allows air to escape while they're scooping water. Basically, so the water has somewhere to go and it's not fighting all the air. So the top of the hopper is open, and it's normally covered by a cowling. Well, apparently, according to this ferry pilot, the day before the accident, the pilot was in St. John's and he had a generator problem, and the mechanics were working on it that day in heavy rain. And I'm assuming what he means is that you need to take the cowling off the plane to access the generator. And it sounds like maybe some water got into the hopper when if you have it open to the rain, water's going to get in. And the mechanics claim that the pilot didn't drain the hopper and refill it, with fuel before the flight. And he says that seeing that the plane lost engine power about 120 miles out from St. John's, he says that's about when he's ferrying these planes, that's when they switch over from the wing tanks to the ferry tank or the hopper. And if that ferry tank had water in it, water contamination, that could be a likely cause of losing your engine. Basically, too much water in the fuel, the engine's going to quit. And that makes perfect sense. I mean, looking at, again, when I started looking at the flight profile, if it was icing, he wouldn't have just immediately dropped off the radar. When you pick up icing, if usually you're having a big problem with icing, the plane will start getting heavier and heavier and start losing altitude, and that doesn't seem to be what happened. And if you're a smart pilot and you start picking up icing, you turn around, and he didn't do that either. Basically, plane just dropped off the radar. It was at about 6,000 feet and just was in the water shortly thereafter. And that kind of leads me to believe that maybe he lost the engine. And if the mechanics were working on the plane in the rain and water got into the hopper where he's storing the extra fuel, basically they use the hopper as the ferry tank, that would definitely explain why the engine would quit suddenly. And ferry tanks are notorious for these kinds of problems. I've had them myself. I lost a ferry tank system in a F-33 Bonanza. I was ferrying from St. John's to Paris about 4 hours out. I lost the pressurization system and had to manually pressurize the ferry tank with my mouth, basically blowing into the tube. And another time in a Mooney, I lost the ferry tank system malfunctioned, and I lost the engine completely, and I went from 19,000 feet all the way down to about 2,000 feet before I got the engine back. So ferry tanks are notorious for causing problems. And this brought to light a problem or an issue that I've been worried about for a long time when using ferry tanks, and that is there's almost never a way to sump a ferry tank. Basically, like you sump a normal tank, the lowest point, you can take some fuel out and look for contaminants like water. And that's probably the case with the hopper in the Fireboss, because it's not meant to be sumped because it's not a fuel tank. Normally it's a water tank. You don't check a water tank for water. It's supposed to have water in it. But when they convert it for ferry flight to use as a ferry tank, basically they just put fuel in there, run a fuel line into it, and then they can use that fuel for the long flight from St. John's to Santa Maria. And so there's no way to drain that tank. And I could definitely see a pilot either A, not thinking about it, or B, not thinking it would be a problem, and like, I'm not going to drain the hundreds of gallons of fuel he might have in that hopper. You know, that's going to cost the company money, or him the money if he's, you know, if he's contracted on a flat rate. So he might just go for it and not think, there's not much water got in there. But it wouldn't take a lot of water. And if the mechanics are working in heavy rain, you could definitely get some water in that hopper. And when you turn the hopper on, when you switch from the wing tanks over to the hopper, that would definitely kill the engine if it sucks up a bunch of water. So possible cause there. Now, another interesting email I got was from a friend of mine who's a Canadian SAR-Tech, or search and rescue technician. And he just happened to be on the C-130 that was directed to the site of the crash right after it happened. Now, this was just pure luck that they happened to be in the area. They were on a training flight from Greenwood, Nova Scotia to St. John's when they got a call from ATC that the Fireboss had gone down. They had a spot tracker location on them, so they were diverted to the crash site. And my friend and another SAR-Tech were going to be tasked to jump into the crash site, because obviously a C-130 is not a seaplane, it can't land. So they were going to parachute into the crash site and see if they could help the pilot and rescue the pilot. Now, immediately these guys realized this was a very serious and very dangerous situation. I mean, the conditions were less than favorable, solid overcast. Until they got down there, they didn't know how hot, what the base of the clouds were, or how high they were going to be. But they knew that the winds were really high. I think they're forecast over 35 knots, which means a really high sea state, probably 5 to 6 foot swells, maybe more. And obviously really cold water. It's the North Atlantic in early spring, so that water is really cold. It's cold all the time, but especially that time of year. And they realized right away that they didn't really have time to say a proper goodbye to their families when they left that morning, or whenever they left the house, maybe a couple days prior, because they figured they're just being on a training mission. Real search and rescues, real live missions are few and far between in the search and rescue community. And this one was probably one of the most dangerous conditions they could possibly jump into. Compounded by the fact that there was a Canadian Cormorant, a search and rescue helicopter, en route, but that was going to be 2 hours out. So they were going to be on their own for at least 2 hours. And that's kind of an issue, because as soon as you jump into the North Atlantic, whether you're a ferry pilot who just happened to crash into the North Atlantic, or a SAR-Tech who's jumping in on purpose, the second you hit that water, the clock starts. You only have so much survival time. And if there's something went wrong with that helicopter, it had to turn around or couldn't find him, or if the ships that were diverted, those Coast Guard ships were diverted immediately, if they couldn't find them right away, they'd be on their own. Now, the C-130 would have obviously been circling the area, keeping track of the guys as best they could, but that's also not a given. I mean, it's pretty hard to spot a guy in the water, even with all the stuff that the SAR-Techs carry with them. I'm sure they have flares and strobe lights and dye markers and all that stuff. You could still get lost. And the C-130 has the ability to drop 2 10-man life rafts to it, but again, in those winds, easy to miss the mark and drop them out of reach of the SAR-Techs. So they were obviously concerned with the situation. He tells me that they were getting each other all pumped up, saying, "We got this. We've got our fins. We're going to crush these waves. We're going to swim right through them." They really focused on the fact that they really needed to stay together, holding hands if possible, because they get separated in those conditions with those high waves, very easily separated and lose sight of each other. So this was obviously a very dangerous situation. Now, these SAR-Techs are amazing guys and gals. I mean, they are highly motivated, highly trained. I think it's an 11-month course, and they're trained in sea rescue, Arctic rescue, mountain rescue, both summer and winter. Every condition you can imagine. They're all paramedics, so they can take care of anybody that they find, because obviously in plane crashes you're most likely going to have injured pilots and passengers to deal with. So these are some of the best, and these guys were pumped up. Now, luckily for them and unlucky for the pilot, I guess, when they got on scene and the C-130 got below the clouds, they realized the clouds were too low to jump. I mean, I think there was like 200 to 300 foot ceilings, maybe a little bit higher than that. And even though, yeah, the C-130 could go up higher, get them up to 2,000 feet and drop them, they'd be in the clouds under canopy and wouldn't be able to steer toward any wreckage or a pilot in a life raft or anything like that. They'd basically just be dropping blind. Plus, they would lose sight of each other and probably land quite a ways away from each other. So it was deemed just too dangerous to drop them, which was probably a good thing. It was just an unnecessary risk for these two SARTECs. So what the C-130 did is they circled around. They were able to find the float, like was reported. They were the ones who found the float from the Fireboss, the one float. And they didn't see anything else at the time, maybe a little bit of an oil slick, but they found the float. And so then they flew downwind and they were able to locate the life raft. It was a one-man life raft. It was deployed. It was inflated. They said it was upside down. The cover was open. The sea anchor was deployed, which probably happens automatically, and also there was some sort of tool bag there, but there was no sign of the pilot. Now, obviously, that's a really bad outcome for the pilot, but it kind of puts a little bit more light on what possibly happened. Now, one thing that I haven't mentioned is that the C-130 was on site within about 30 minutes of the crash. They happened to be really close, and they were directed there immediately. So they were on scene very quickly. And the fact that they didn't find the pilot tells me that he might not have been wearing a survival suit. Because if he had been in a survival suit, they probably would have found him. Even if he lost his grip on the raft and it drifted away, he probably wouldn't have gone much further than the float. He would have been in that immediate area. And they searched and searched and searched, and they didn't find anything. They stayed on station until the Cormorant got there, and I believe maybe even until one of the Coast Guard ships got there. So they did an extensive search of the area, and the fact that they had no sight of the pilot means he probably drowned and then sank. Because if he was in a survival suit, even if he died of his injuries, or I don't think he probably would have drowned if he had been in a survival suit, he would have continued to float. You don't have to swim to stay afloat with those survival suits. They're pretty buoyant. When I was going through the training that I did in Iceland, you don't have to work at all to stay afloat. They're very buoyant. And you might not even had a life jacket, because, well, if you don't have a survival suit, a life jacket's not going to do you a whole lot of good anyway, because the water's just too cold. And another thing that I noticed, that he said that he had a one-man life raft, which is sort of common in the ferry pilot community. You figure, well, I've got a carrier raft, I want something small. But I never use a one-man life raft. I always use at least a four-man life raft, because the problem with the one-man life raft is it's really small, and you don't get any barrier from the cold water. You're going to be really close to the cold water. There's just no room, and it probably doesn't have much in the way of an insulated floor. You're basically in like a big garbage bag that it has some inflation panels in it, but you're completely surrounded by cold water. Now, the bigger rafts have an insulated floor, which is very important because it insulates you from that cold water. Because that heat, all the heat in your body is going to get just sucked right through the floor. Because if you're just basically sitting on a piece of rubber that's in the cold North Atlantic water, it's going to really be cold, and that's going to suck the heat right from your body, even through a survival suit. And that's the other reason that even when I am wearing a survival suit, I'm wearing a fair amount of clothes underneath underneath the survival suit. I wear long underwear, usually just jeans and a t-shirt and a sweatshirt or something, but you really should have a fair amount of clothes on, because the survival suits will keep you dry. It's kind of like a dry suit. It's not as essential, it's not a dry suit as in like a scuba diving, but they're sealed up and they will keep you dry. And being warm that's is very important because that's what's going to kill you in the raft. You can't survive forever in the raft because sooner or later you're going to succumb to hypothermia. That water is so cold and the air is pretty cold. Eventually, you're going to freeze to death. So I'm not a big fan of the one-man life rafts. Now, both the Sartecs who were going to jumping also had their own personal life rafts with them. They are, again, one-man life rafts. I think they're worn in between the parachute pack and their back. They're kind of folded up so they fit in between your back. So that's kind of their last-ditch thing in case the C-130 can't drop the two life rafts to them or they don't get picked up right away. They can survive a while in their survival suits in those rafts. But, boy, I sure like a big raft, but that single man life raft that the ferry pilot had, probably inadequate for the North Atlantic this time of year. Now, I still can't imagine what was going through these Sartecs' minds when they thought they might have to parachute into the North Atlantic in these conditions. Because imagine suddenly being in that situation, having to jump into the water 130 miles from shore and hope that you're going to get picked up. It was concerning because in the Sartec community, you never know when you're going to be tasked to do something like this where you very well could lose your life. But that's their job. That's why their motto is so that others may live. My hat's off to these guys. It was a potentially really dangerous situation, and if they'd, managed to jump, I'm sure they would have pulled it off. Their training was excellent. They've got a good way to be kept track of them. There were ships on the way and a helicopter on the way. I'm certain that they would have been picked up, but you just never know when you jump into the North Atlantic that you're going to get rescued in time. All right, well, hats off to these guys. They're the guardian angels of the ferry pilot community and everybody else that flies around Canada, and I'm really glad that they're out there. I hope I never have to use their services, but it's good to know they're there. All right, well, that's all I've got for now. As always, thanks for watching, and don't forget to keep your speed up.